3 months ago I stood on a stage with a microphone in my hand, and I could not say a single sentence in English about my own son. The room was full of parents, teachers, and children. Everyone was watching. My son was sitting in the front row with his classmates. He was smiling, waiting to hear me speak. The teacher handed me the microphone and said, "Please tell us something about your child." I opened my mouth, but nothing came out. My mind went completely blank. I knew what I wanted to say. I had practiced it in my head many times. But at that moment, the words simply disappeared. The silence in the room felt heavier with every second. I could feel dozens of eyes staring at me. And that was the moment I realized something painful. For years I had avoided English. But now English had finally cornered me. And I had nowhere left to hide. It was my son's annual day at school. The auditorium was bright and full of people. Parents sat in long rows of chairs while children waited excitedly in the front. Colorful decorations covered the stage. Teachers walked around, organizing the program. Everyone looked happy. Everyone looked confident. The host of the event walked onto the stage with a smile. "Today," she said, "we will also invite some parents to say a few words about their children." The audience clapped politely. At first, it felt like a simple activity. One parent after another stood up and spoke. A mother walked to the microphone and spoke beautiful English. She talked about how proud she was of her daughter. People clapped. Then a father came to the stage. He spoke about how his son loved science and dreamed of becoming an astronaut. Again, the audience applauded. Each parent spoke clearly and confidently. Some were emotional. Some were funny. But all of them spoke in English. As I watched them, a quiet fear started growing inside me. I understood English. But speaking it in front of everyone? That was different. I told myself maybe they would not call my name. Maybe the teacher would choose someone else. But then I heard it. "My next parent is..." She paused and looked at her paper. "My next parent is Mr. Daniel." For a moment, I hoped there was another Daniel in the room. But there wasn't. People turned their heads and looked at me. My son looked back from the front row. He was smiling proudly. "That's my dad," his eyes seemed to say. Slowly I stood up. My legs felt heavier than usual as I walked toward the stage. The teacher handed me the microphone. "Please tell us something about your son," she said kindly. I nodded. The microphone was in my hand. My son was looking at me. The entire room was silent. I opened my mouth. And suddenly my mind went blank. I wanted to say something simple. "My son is kind." Or maybe, "He loves drawing." But the words refused to come out. All I managed to say was, "My son, he's very good boy." The sentence sounded broken. Awkward. Wrong. A few people smiled politely. But I could feel the embarrassment spreading across my face. The teacher gently took the microphone back and thanked me. I walked back to my seat slowly. And in that moment, I felt smaller than I had ever felt in my life. Not because my English was bad, but because my son had believed in me, and I had failed to speak for him. The program ended an hour later. Children ran around the hall laughing and celebrating. Parents were taking photos with their kids. But I felt strangely quiet inside. I smiled for my son. I clapped for his performance. I even took pictures with him like the other parents. But deep down, something inside me felt heavy. On the way home, my son was talking excitedly in the car. He told me about his friends, about the games they played backstage, about the snacks the teacher gave them. I listened and smiled, but my mind kept going back to that moment on the stage. The microphone, the silence, the broken sentence. "My son, very good boy." I had spoken like a child who was learning his first words. When we reached home, my son ran to his room to change his clothes. A few minutes later, he came back and sat next to me on the couch. He looked at me with innocent curiosity. "Dad," he asked softly, "why didn't you talk more on the stage?" The question was simple, but it felt like a small arrow hitting my chest. I forced a small smile. "I was a little nervous," I said. He nodded and accepted the answer easily. Children don't question things for long. But after he went to sleep that night, I sat alone in the living room. The house was completely silent. And for the first time, I allowed myself to think honestly. Why was I so afraid of speaking English? I had studied it in school. I understood most of it. I watched movies in English. Yet the moment I had to speak in front of people, I froze. Then the truth slowly became clear. I was not afraid of English. I was afraid of embarrassment. For years I had avoided situations where I had to speak. I told myself excuses. I don't need it. I'll learn later. It's not important. But that night something changed. Because the problem was no longer about me. It was about my son. And the next time someone asked me to speak about him, I wanted to speak with confidence, not with fear. So I made a decision that night. A simple but powerful decision. I would finally learn to speak English. Not slowly, not someday, but starting the very next morning. The next morning I woke up with determination. I told myself that things would be different now. I would finally improve my English. But at the beginning, I made the same mistakes that millions of learners make. My first idea was simple. I bought a thick English grammar book. Every day after work I sat at my desk and studied rules. Past tense, future tense, present perfect. I filled pages with exercises. For a few days it felt productive. I felt like I was studying seriously. But something strange happened. Even after learning all those rules, I still could not speak. If someone asked me a simple question like, "What did you do today?" my mind froze. I knew the grammar, but I could not form the sentence quickly. So I tried another method. Vocabulary. I downloaded an app and started memorizing words. 10 words every day. Sometimes 20. Soon I had long lists in my notebook. Beautiful words. Difficult words. Advanced words. But when I tried to speak, those words disappeared from my mind. I knew them when I saw them, but not when I needed them. Then I tried something else. Watching English videos. Every evening I watched lessons online. Teachers explained grammar. They explained pronunciation. They explained everything. And I understood almost all of it. But the next day when I tried to speak, the same problem returned. Silence. My brain still refused to cooperate. After 2 weeks I felt frustrated. I was studying every day. I was learning new information. But my speaking ability was not changing. One evening I closed my notebook and asked myself an honest question. Why am I still unable to speak? And slowly the answer became obvious. I had been studying English, but I had never truly practiced speaking it. I knew rules. I knew vocabulary. I knew explanations. But language is not learned through explanations. Language is learned through use. That realization changed everything. Because I finally understood something important. If I wanted to speak English, I had to start using it every single day. Even if it felt uncomfortable. Even if I made mistakes. And that was the moment my real learning journey finally began. A few days later, something interesting happened. I was watching a video of a man who had learned English very quickly. He was not a teacher. He was just a regular learner sharing his experience. But one sentence he said caught my attention. He said, "Language is not a subject. It is a habit." At first I didn't fully understand what he meant. But the more I thought about it, the more it started making sense. I realized something simple. When children learn their first language, they don't study grammar books. They don't memorize vocabulary lists. They simply use the language every day. They hear it. They repeat it. They experiment with it. And slowly, their brain adapts. I looked at my own routine and saw the problem clearly. I was studying English like a school subject, but I had never made it part of my daily life. English was something I opened in a book, then closed again. What if I changed that? What if English became something I used every single day? Not just for studying, but for thinking, speaking, describing my life. That idea felt powerful. So I made a new rule for myself. From that day forward, English would not be something I studied for 1 hour. It would become something I lived with throughout the day. At first it sounded difficult, but I decided to try. Because at that point I had already learned one important lesson. The old methods were not working. If I wanted a different result, I needed a completely different system. And that was the moment my real progress finally began. The next morning I started something new. No grammar book. No vocabulary lists. No complicated lessons. Just one simple goal. Use English every single day. At first I asked myself a very practical question. What do I actually need to say in daily life? Not fancy sentences. Not academic English. Just simple things. So I created what I called my survival sentences. I sat down with a notebook and wrote about 50 short sentences. Sentences I could use in normal situations. For example, hello, how are you? Can you repeat that please? I'm learning English. I don't understand. Could you speak more slowly? They were simple, almost childish, but they were real. Every morning I stood in front of the mirror and read those sentences out loud. Not once. Not twice. 10 times. At first my tongue felt stiff. The sounds felt strange. But after a few days something interesting happened. Those sentences became automatic. I didn't have to think about them anymore. They just came out naturally. That small change gave me confidence. But I didn't stop there. I added another habit. Talking to myself. It might sound strange, but this was one of the most powerful things I ever did. Whenever I was alone, I spoke English out loud. When I was making breakfast, I described what I was doing. I am cooking eggs. The pan is hot. I need some salt. When I was walking outside, I described what I saw. The sky is cloudy today. That man is walking his dog. I see a red car. At first it felt a little silly. I even laughed at myself sometimes. But then I realized something important. This was my private classroom. There was no teacher, no judgment, no embarrassment. And the more I spoke, the more comfortable I became. Something amazing started happening inside my brain. Instead of translating sentences from my language into English, English words started appearing directly in my thoughts. Slowly, very slowly, but clearly. For the first time, English stopped feeling like a school subject. It started feeling like a real language. And that small shift made a huge difference in my progress. Because once you begin using a language daily, your brain slowly learns how to live inside it. After a few weeks of speaking to myself every day, I noticed something interesting. My confidence was improving, but my speaking speed was still slow. When someone asked me a question, my brain needed time to build the answer. I knew the words, but connecting them quickly was difficult. So I created another exercise. I called it the question and answer method. The idea was very simple. I would ask myself a question in English. Then I would answer it immediately, without overthinking, without translating. For example, I started with a simple question. What did you do today? My first answer was very short. I worked. But then I forced myself to expand it. I worked on my project. Then again. I worked on my project for 3 hours. And again. I worked on my project for 3 hours and then I took a break. Each time I added a little more information. This trained my brain to build sentences faster. I repeated this process every day with different questions. What did you eat today? Where do you want to travel? What are your goals for the future? At first the answers were small, but slowly they became longer and more natural. And something very important started happening. My brain stopped searching for perfect grammar. Instead, it focused on communicating ideas. That is exactly how real conversations work. But there was another problem I wanted to fix. My pronunciation. Even when I spoke English, my accent was very strong. People could understand me, but I didn't sound natural. So I started using another technique. The echo method. Here's how it worked. I listened to short sentences spoken by native speakers. Sometimes from movies. Sometimes from podcasts. Sometimes from YouTube videos. After hearing a sentence, I paused the audio. Then I repeated the sentence exactly the same way. The same speed. The same rhythm. The same emotion. For example, if the speaker said, "I don't know what you're talking about," I paused and repeated it. "I don't know what you're talking about." Not slowly, not word by word, but as one natural sentence. At first it was difficult. My tongue didn't want to cooperate. But after repeating the same sentence 10 times, something started to change. My pronunciation improved. My rhythm improved. And my English started sounding more natural. Little by little, my voice began to resemble the voices I was hearing. And that gave me a new kind of confidence. The confidence that comes when you start sounding like a real speaker. By this time my speaking was improving. My pronunciation was getting better. And my confidence was slowly growing. But there was still one important problem. Vocabulary. I knew many basic words, but I wanted to express more ideas. At first I tried the usual method, memorizing long lists of vocabulary. But I quickly realized something. When you memorize words alone, they disappear from your memory very quickly. Your brain doesn't know how to use them. So I tried a different approach. I called it the story method. Instead of learning 20 random words, I chose 5 new words every day. Only 5. But I forced myself to use all 5 words inside a short story. For example, one day my 5 words were excited, invitation, party, arrive, surprise. So I created a simple story. I was very excited because I received an invitation to a party. When I arrived at the party, I got a big surprise. Then I read that story out loud several times. Because stories are easier for the brain to remember. Our brains naturally remember narratives better than isolated words. After doing this every day for a few months, something amazing happened. My vocabulary started growing quickly. And more importantly, I knew how to use those words in real sentences. But the biggest change came when I started training my mind to think in English. Most language learners make one critical mistake. They think in their native language first. Then they translate the sentence into English. That process is slow and exhausting. So I decided to stop translating. Instead, I started describing everything around me in English. When I walked outside, I said in my mind, "The sky is blue. The weather is warm. I see people walking." When I sat at my desk, I thought, "I am working. I need coffee. My computer is slow today." These small thoughts train my brain to build sentences automatically. And finally, I created one simple rule. A rule that changed everything. Every day, I had to speak English for at least 2 hours. No excuses. If I had nobody to talk to, I talked to myself. If I was cooking, I spoke English. If I was walking outside, I spoke English. Even when I felt lazy, I reminded myself of that moment on the stage at my son's school. The embarrassment. The silence. That memory pushed me forward. And slowly, day by day, something incredible began to happen. English stopped feeling like a foreign language. It started feeling like a natural part of my life. About 2 months after I started my new routine, something surprising happened. It was a normal evening. I had just finished dinner and was sitting at my desk. Like many other nights, I decided to join an online English practice group. People from different countries joined these meetings to practice speaking together. At first, I was always nervous during these calls. I listened more than I spoke. I was afraid that my sentences would sound strange. But that night something felt different. The host of the meeting asked a simple question. What is something you learned recently? Normally, I would take a long time to prepare my answer. But this time the words came out almost automatically. Recently I learned that practicing a language every day is more important than studying it for many hours once a week. As soon as I finished speaking, something strange happened. No one looked confused. No one asked me to repeat myself. Instead, one of the participants nodded and replied, "That's a really good point." Another person asked me, "So what kind of practice do you do every day?" And suddenly, we were having a real conversation. Not a practice exercise. Not a slow, careful exchange of simple words. A real conversation. People asked questions. I answered them. Sometimes I even joked a little. And the most surprising part was this. I understood everything they were saying. For the first time, I wasn't translating in my head. The words simply made sense. The meeting lasted about 40 minutes. When it ended, I closed my laptop and sat quietly in my chair. I replayed the conversation in my mind. Only 2 months earlier, I had stood on a stage unable to say even one clear sentence. Now I had just spoken with strangers from different countries, completely in English. It wasn't perfect. I still made small mistakes. But something had clearly changed. And in that moment, I felt a kind of confidence I had never felt before. Not the loud confidence of pretending to be fluent, but the quiet confidence of knowing that real progress was happening. For the first time, I truly believed that fluency was possible. And that belief gave me even more motivation to continue, because I knew the journey was not finished yet, but I had finally crossed the hardest part of the road. A few weeks after that online meeting, something unexpected happened. My son came home from school with an announcement. "Dad," he said excitedly, "our school is having another parent event next week." The moment he said those words, a familiar memory flashed through my mind. The stage, the microphone, the silence. For a second, I felt the same nervous feeling in my stomach. But this time something inside me was different. I had been practicing every day for almost 3 months. Speaking, listening, thinking in English. This time, I didn't want to avoid the situation. In fact, I wanted another chance. A week later we returned to the same school auditorium. The room looked exactly the same as before. Parents sitting in rows. Children waiting near the stage. Teachers walking around with clipboards. But this time, my heart was calmer. Not because I was perfectly fluent, but because I knew I had practiced. And practice creates a quiet kind of confidence. The event began. Performances. Speeches. Applause. And then the host made an announcement. Once again, she said, "We would love to hear from some parents." A few parents raised their hands. And before I could change my mind, I raised mine too. My son looked at me with surprise. Then he smiled. A few minutes later, my name was called. I stood up and walked toward the stage. The same stage where I had once felt completely helpless. The teacher handed me the microphone. "Please tell us something about your child," she said. I took a small breath. Then I began to speak. "My son is one of the most curious people I know." The words came out smoothly. I am very proud of him because he always asks questions and loves learning new things. The room was silent, but this time the silence felt different. People were listening, not waiting for me to struggle, just listening. I continued speaking for almost a full minute. When I finished, the audience applauded. But the most important moment was not the applause. It was when I looked down at the front row. My son was smiling, and this time, I knew I had spoken for him the way I always wanted to. After the event finished, many parents came to talk to me. Some of them said my speech was simple but very sincere. But honestly, the applause and compliments were not the most important part for me. The most important moment happened a few minutes later. My son walked toward me with a big smile. "Dad," he said, "you spoke really well today." His words were simple, but they meant more to me than anything else. Because 3 months earlier, that same stage had been a place of embarrassment, the place where I felt small and powerless. But now it had become something completely different. Proof that change is possible. As we walked home that evening, I thought about everything that had happened during those months. The uncomfortable practice. The mistakes. The days when I felt lazy but still forced myself to continue. None of it was easy, but every small effort had slowly built something powerful. Confidence. And that is the real secret of learning any language. Fluency is not magic. It is not talent. It is simply the result of small actions repeated every day. If you listen, speak, read, and practice consistently, your brain will adapt. Slowly, but surely. So if you feel embarrassed about your English right now, remember something. The person you are today is not the person you will be 6 months from now. Start practicing. Start speaking. Even if it feels uncomfortable. Because one day, you might look back at the moment that once embarrassed you and realize that it was the moment that changed your life.